The Canadian Prime Minister has just openly charged the U.S. President with operating a corruption plot from within the White House, and he presented the evidence. Mark Carney published a 247-page file this morning, including internal papers, financial data, classified messages, and statements from a high-ranking U.S. official that, if confirmed, would represent the biggest corruption case in contemporary presidential history. And Warren Buffett, who has never once in his whole professional life weighed in on a current president's legal or moral issues, just violated that principle with a remark so harsh that legal experts are labeling it the most harmful support of a corruption claim ever issued by a private individual in U.S. history. But here's what elevates this beyond the corruption alone. There was a concealment, a planned, organized attempt within the Trump administration to designate the proof as secret, relocate the staff who discovered it, and warn the Canadian envoys who disclosed it. The corruption is the controversy. The concealment is the emergency. When you learn what's inside that file, who's implicated, what they attempted to conceal, and what Buffett claims this signifies for the future of the U.S. presidency, you'll grasp why this isn't simply one more controversy. This is the one that could persist. Sign up now because this narrative is on the verge of erupting. Let me guide you through precisely how this developed, because the account of how Carney uncovered this corruption is nearly as remarkable as the corruption itself. It began amid standard U.S.-Canada trade talks, the sort of tedious, specialized, profoundly dull diplomatic labor that occurs constantly between the two nations. Canadian trade representatives on the bargaining team started observing inconsistencies in the American stances. Specific requests lacked economic rationale. Firms that ought to have been pushing hard for tariff reductions were notably silent, as if they'd already been handled via some alternative route. At the same time, other firms that had no clear interest in the particular tariff groups under discussion were abruptly advocating intensely for waivers, appearing in sessions they had no cause to join, presenting points that didn't match their true commercial concerns. The trends didn't compute. Canadian trade experts are educated to identify economic nonsense in negotiation stances. It's how you notice when the opposing side is pretending or concealing something. And what they observed opposite their U.S. colleagues was profoundly nonsensical. Unless a secondary group of incentives was functioning behind the formal stance, that's when Canadian intelligence became engaged. CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, was already performing standard surveillance of exchanges around the trade talks, which is typical procedure between friendly countries during major economic discussions. It's not espionage in the hostile meaning. It's the intelligence version of due diligence. And amid that surveillance, CSIS experts detected mentions of what internal exchanges termed a parallel procedure, a secondary path of talks occurring completely beyond official routes. This parallel path included Trump-linked go-betweens convening privately with firms pursuing tariff waivers, beyond the standard bargaining structure, beyond congressional supervision, and beyond the sight of the long-term public employees who were meant to be overseeing the trade connection. This is the point it shifted from a trade oddity to an intelligence issue. Over the following few months, CSIS and the Canadian Foreign Ministry compiled what would turn into the file. 247 pages of papers, financial data, business submissions, internal exchanges acquired via intelligence paths, and via one remarkable source, a high-ranking U.S. trade representative who had been observing the corruption develop from within and could no longer remain quiet. This individual, whose name stays safeguarded under Canadian intelligence rules, discreetly supplied verifying papers to their Canadian peers during a diplomatic meeting in Ottawa. This wasn't a disclosure driven by politics or individual complaint. This was a long-term public employee, someone who had devoted decades to government work, who observed corruption occur live inside their own administration and concluded that their pledge to the U.S. Constitution was more important than their allegiance to any leadership. The finished file was examined by Canadian legal specialists, approved by CSIS executives, and importantly distributed beforehand with main Commonwealth intelligence allies in the United Kingdom and Australia for separate confirmation. Both affirmed the documentary proof was genuine. Carney's initial reaction was to manage it discreetly. He adhered to diplomatic procedure precisely. He informed the White House via the Canadian ambassador that inconsistencies had been identified in the trade talks and asked for a confidential conversation to settle the issue. The reply from the Trump administration was prompt, firm, and profoundly implicating. They didn't probe. They didn't pose inquiries. They didn't seek additional specifics. They concealed it. Exchanges linked to the side channel talks were backdated as national security delicate. Two high-ranking U.S. trade representatives who had internally voiced worries about the secondary path were transferred to unconnected roles within weeks of Carney's alert. Canadian embassy personnel who had disclosed the inconsistencies via appropriate routes got what Carney subsequently called clear indications that additional probing would carry repercussions for the wider two-way relationship. And then in what legal experts are terming the most legally careless action of the whole concealment, the Trump administration asked that the Canadian government endorse non-disclosure pacts encompassing all casual exchanges linked to the trade talks. The concealment started the instant Carney attempted to address it privately, and that's when he reached his choice. This couldn't be settled via confidential routes. The confidential routes had been employed to suppress it. The world required to view this. Carney distributed the file at the same time to the Washington Post, the Financial Times, the BBC, and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Then he approached the lectern. Now let me lead you through what's really inside the file, because the details are more condemning than any overview can express. The core of the corruption plot is what probers are labeling the tariff waiver payback conduit. Here's how it functioned. Firms pursuing waivers from the steel and aluminum tariffs, waivers that are fully valid under the tariff system and are intended to be awarded based on economic value through a clear application method, were being subtly guided via unofficial routes to a web of Trump-linked advisory companies. These companies, several of which were set up in the months right after the tariff declarations, levied guidance charges ranging from 2 to 5% of the anticipated tariff reductions. A firm projecting to save $100 million in tariffs would remit a $2 to $5 million guidance charge to an advisory company whose sole credential was its closeness to the president's close group. The charges were channeled through a web of dummy firms listed in Delaware and Wyoming, states whose business secrecy regulations make it unusually hard to follow true ownership. But Canadian forensic bookkeepers operating from financial data acquired via intelligence paths and supported by the American informant followed the fund transfers from the firms seeking waivers through the dummy units, through the advisory companies, and finally to units linked to Trump family members and key political contributors. One particular instance outlined in the file is crushing in its precision. A medium-sized U.S. production firm remitted a $4.7 million guidance charge to one of the linked advisory companies. Within 3 weeks, the firm obtained a tariff waiver worth roughly $180 million in projected reductions over the duration of the tariff span. That's not guidance. That's a toll gate. You desire entry to your own government's waiver method, you remit the charge, and the charge streams into the wallets of the president's personal web. The file names at least 14 firms that pursued this identical route. Remit the charge, obtain the waiver, and never discuss it with anyone. But the payback plot was merely the initial level. While the open trade talks between the U.S. and Canada were stalled, while Carney and Trump's trade delegates were openly debating over tariff levels and market entry, a hidden secondary talk was in progress. Trump-associated go-betweens were bargaining favored entry to Canadian Vital Minerals for a group of firms with direct and identifiable connections to the Trump Organization: lithium, nickel, cobalt. The precise assets that the whole worldwide economy is competing to obtain for the shift to electric vehicles and sophisticated devices. The group would remit 30 to 40% below current commodity market levels, a reduction worth hundreds of millions of dollars over the span of the setup, and the gains would stream through a series of limited liability firms that Canadian probers meticulously followed back to units managed by Trump family members. The President of the United States was employing trade talks that impact the incomes of millions of Americans and Canadians as camouflage to obtain personal commercial agreements worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The tariffs weren't simply poor strategy, they were a diversion, a smokescreen. The disorder of the trade conflict offered camouflage for the actual deal occurring in the darkness. And then there's the diplomatic blackmail. The file holds proof, internal exchanges, dated notes, email sequences with data indicating that Trump personally ordered diplomatic force on Canadian representatives to accelerate approvals for a Trump-branded high-end building venture near Toronto. American trade delegates were directed to suggest, not declare outright, but suggest through precisely crafted wording that the wider trade talks would be less fruitful if the Canadian oversight schedule for the building venture faced postponements. One internal exchange from a high-ranking Trump consultant replicated completely in the file reads, "Make sure Ottawa comprehends the link between their oversight schedule and our adaptability at the table." That phrase is a decisive proof in 11 words. That's not diplomacy. That's blackmail. It's employing the economic bond between two independent countries, a bond that affects the employment, costs, and wealth of hundreds of millions of people as influence for a property agreement. Canadian representatives who got this force recorded everything. Dated notes submitted the same day, taped calls lawful under Canadian national law, email sequences saved in 3 copies on protected government systems, and then the concealment. When Carney's government attempted to tackle the inconsistencies via correct diplomatic routes, the Trump administration didn't probe. It didn't request more details. It didn't show worry or vow responsibility. It concealed 4 actions, each more legally dangerous than the previous. Action 1, designate. Exchanges related to the side channel talks were backdated as national security delicate content, which eliminated them from the grasp of congressional supervision groups and protected them from Freedom of Information Act demands. The designation power of the United States government, a setup created to safeguard true national security confidences, was utilized as a weapon to conceal proof of presidential corruption. Action 2, transfer. 2 high-ranking long-term trade representatives who had internally expressed concerns about the secondary path were taken from their roles and transferred to unconnected sectors within weeks. Neither received a rationale. Neither was charged with misconduct. They were just shifted discreetly, effectively, and with clear purpose. Action 3, warn. Canadian embassy personnel who had disclosed the inconsistencies via correct diplomatic routes got indications delivered through go-betweens and through changes in diplomatic manner that seasoned envoys identified right away that additional probing would carry adverse repercussions for the wider two-way relationship. Action 4, suppress. The Trump administration officially asked that the Canadian government endorse non-disclosure pacts encompassing all casual exchanges linked to the trade talks, an NDA between 2 independent governments to conceal corruption. Legal experts are terming this the lone most implicating aspect of the whole concealment because the NDA demand has no valid diplomatic function. You don't request a foreign government to endorse a non-disclosure pact unless you're attempting to stop something particular from being revealed. Designate, transfer, warn, suppress. That's not harm regulation. That's not emergency handling. That's interference. That is a president employing the designation power, the staff authority, and the diplomatic apparatus of the most influential government on earth to conceal proof of his own corruption. And then Warren Buffett issued the remark that converted a foreign policy controversy into a national confrontation. In 70 years of public existence, Warren Buffett has upheld one complete principle. He does not weigh in on presidential legal issues, not Watergate, when he was already one of the most notable investors in America, not Iran-Contra, not the Clinton impeachment, not either of Trump's first or second impeachments, not any of the criminal charges. In every instance, through every leadership, through every controversy that engulfed Washington and controlled every cable news cycle, Buffett remained quiet. He viewed it as beyond his position as an investor and business executive. He thought basically that the structures of American governance, the courts, the Congress, the Department of Justice would eventually self-adjust, that the setup had inherent systems for responsibility, and that his role was to invest in that setup, not to judge its shortcomings. But today, the 94-year-old investor violated that 70-year principle. and the reality that he violated it, the pure historical significance of what it means that Warren Buffett chose this particular controversy was the one he could no longer remain quiet about, tells you more about the gravity of this file than any legal examination or congressional session ever could. I've devoted my career to analyzing businesses, Buffett stated, how they're managed, how they thrive, and how they crumble. The pattern outlined in the Canadian file is one I've observed 100 times in the private sector. When management enriches itself at the cost of the entity it was assigned to lead, the entity ultimately falls apart. It doesn't matter how large the entity is. It doesn't matter how robust it seems from the exterior. Once the management is plundering the funds, fall apart is a question of time. The only distinction here is that the entity is the United States government. He went on, "The concealment troubles me more than the corruption alone. Corruption can be pursued legally. Corruption can be penalized. Individual corrupt participants can be pinpointed and eliminated. But when a government deliberately employs its designation power, its staff authority, and its diplomatic influence to conceal proof of misconduct from its own people and its own Congress, you're no longer handling a corrupt person. You're handling a corrupt setup. And corrupt setups, in my experience, don't correct themselves. They have to be corrected from the exterior." And then the third statement, the one that hit with the impact of a court decision and was recited aloud on the Senate floor within hours. Trust is the basis of every structure, every firm, every government, every partnership. What this file outlines is the organized ruin of that trust for personal gain. And once trust is ruined, the structure follows. I have observed it occur to firms I've invested in. I have observed it occur to sectors. I pray it does not occur to this country. But I will not feign the threat isn't genuine. Warren Buffett just likened the Trump administration to a declining firm where executives are plundering the funds while guaranteeing shareholders all is well. And he stated the concealment demonstrates this isn't one faulty participant making bad choices alone. It's a corrupt setup, a seized structure where the apparatus of government has been intentionally converted into a tool of personal gain. Consider what it signifies coming from this particular individual. Buffett has devoted his whole career constructing Berkshire Hathaway on the foundations of complete openness, moral management, and severe honesty. He has dismissed leaders for much less than what's outlined in this file. He famously informed his supervisors, "Lose funds for the firm and I will be sympathetic. Lose a fragment of reputation for the firm and I will be severe." That criterion that the honesty of the structure matters more than any personal gain is the criterion he's now imposing on the United States government. And by that criterion, the government is failing disastrously. In Buffett's realm, the reaction to uncovering fraud is instant and absolute. Probe the extent, reveal the discoveries to participants, and eliminate the individuals accountable. The Trump administration's reaction to the identical uncovering was the exact reverse. Designate the proof, transfer the individuals who uncovered it, and suppress the individuals who disclosed it. Probe, reveal, eliminate versus designate, transfer, suppress. Buffett has observed this second pattern unfold in the business realm dozens of times, and he knows precisely how it concludes. It concludes with fall apart, with legal pursuit, and with everyone who took part wishing they'd voiced concerns earlier. And here's the element that indicates Buffett isn't simply weighing in. He's proceeding on his own examination. Berkshire Hathaway's adherence group has already initiated a thorough examination of every government agreement maintained by every Berkshire affiliate to guarantee that none of them were provided through the contaminated waiver method outlined in the file. Berkshire maintains government agreements worth billions across its affiliates: BNSF Railway, Berkshire Hathaway Energy, Precision Cast Parts, dozens of production and foundation firms. Buffett is handling the United States government as a partner that can no longer be relied upon to function ethically. When the most admired business person in U.S. history determines he needs to review his own firm's connection with the federal government because he can't rely on the government, to be honest, that's not a political remark. That's a business management crisis. That's a five-alarm structural blaze. And Buffett's most crucial point: The one that raises this from a controversy to a systemic emergency is about extent. If the waiver plot involved at least 14 firms, multiple Trump-linked intermediary companies, a web of dummy units across multiple states, a hidden resource agreement, diplomatic blackmail, and a planned for-action concealment across multiple government sectors, then you're not examining one individual's corruption. You're examining a structure that has been seized. One individual is a controversy. A setup is a seized structure, and seized structures don't correct themselves. You can endure a controversy. Buffett stated, "You cannot endure a structure that has been converted into a tool of personal gain, not forever." The calculations don't permit it. The consequences from the file's distribution have been flowing and speeding up by the hour. In Congress, the response divided along expected paths, but with vital breaks. Democrats promptly demanded a special prosecutor, orders for every representative named in the file, and official removal probe. But the more revealing response came from the Republican side. Several senators who have been consistently faithful to Trump through every prior dispute openly demanded a complete and open probe into the claims. That wording is important. They didn't say witch hunt. They didn't say foreign meddling. They said complete and open probe. Observe the wording. When supporters change from witch hunt to we need to uncover the truth, the foundation is moving under the president's position. The Senate Intelligence Committee declared a secret session to examine the file within the week. The assisting informants are increasing. The high-ranking U.S. representative who supplied papers to Canada was not solitary in their worries. They were just the initial to proceed. Within 48 hours of the file's distribution, 2 extra U.S. representatives hired lawyers and indicated their readiness to assist with probers. One of the transferred trade representatives, one of the individuals who was penalized for expressing worries internally, submitted an official informant grievance with the Inspector General, claiming revenge and interference. The concealment generated its own opponents. Every individual who was transferred, every individual who was warned, every individual who was suppressed is now a possible assisting informant, and they're furious. They're furious because they attempted to do the correct thing via appropriate routes, and they were penalized for it. Now the appropriate routes have collapsed. The proof is open, and they have nothing remaining to forfeit. The tools of the concealment are turning into the proof of the concealment. The 14 firms named in the file's waiver payback plot are in complete emergency mode. Stock values dropping. Legal groups activated. Board participants requiring urgent sessions. Banks that enabled the dummy firm deals are performing internal examinations to evaluate their own legal risk. On K Street, Washington's advocacy area, the atmosphere is described as managed alarm. Every advocate who dealt with tariff strategy in the last 2 years is contacting their lawyer. Every firm that obtained a tariff waiver is now questioning whether their waiver was provided on value or whether it went through the corruption conduit without their awareness. Globally, the response has been massive. The European Union, Japan, and South Korea have all officially sought access to the file via diplomatic routes because the clear query is now inevitable. If this corruption plot existed in U.S.-Canada trade talks, did it also function in U.S.-EU trade, in U.S.-Japan trade, in U.S.-Korea trade? Every U.S. trading ally is now inquiring, were we also being manipulated? Were there secondary paths in our talks too? Five Eyes intelligence allies are performing their own examinations, and Mark Carney's status has changed instantly. He could have been charged with foreign meddling. He could have been rejected as a political exploiter attempting to humiliate a competitor. Instead, because the proof was so compelling and so carefully recorded, the story became something much stronger. Carney did what U.S. structures failed to do. The Prime Minister of Canada is performing the task that U.S. prosecutors, U.S. congressional supervision groups, and U.S. intelligence organizations should have been performing throughout. He revealed corruption that the individuals compensated to stop corruption somehow overlooked completely. Consider that for a second. Canada's intelligence service uncovered what the FBI, the DOJ, and the United States Congress all failed to identify. That's not a praise to Canada. That's a charge against every U.S. structure assigned with stopping precisely this. So let's discuss what this signifies at the level of the Constitution and the future of U.S. governance. because the risks here extend far past one file, one president, or one corruption plot. What the file outlines isn't a lone act of corruption. It's not an isolated error in decision. It's a thorough misuse of presidential authority across 4 separate areas, each of which alone signifies a grave breach of the public faith, and which combined signifies something that constitutional experts are finding hard to locate a historical equivalent for. Employing tariff strategy as a personal gain mechanism, guiding firms to remit charges to your personal web in trade for government-awarded waivers. That's misuse of executive economic power. It changes a strategy instrument intended to benefit the national concern into a toll gate that benefits one family's monetary concerns, employing designation powers to backdate, conceal proof of that corruption from Congress and the public. That's not merely a misuse of the national security system, it's the arming of the Confidentiality Foundation that was constructed to shield the country against external dangers turned internal to shield a president against responsibility, employing staff transfer to penalize long-term public employees who attempted to disclose inconsistencies via appropriate routes. That's interference of valid supervision and revenge against safeguarded informant activity and employing diplomatic routes to force a foreign government into accelerating approvals for a private commercial endeavor. That's corruption of foreign strategy itself. It's employing the influence of the United States of America